I'm Gerd Kasper, I'm the president of the American Academy, and I warmly welcome you to what must be a first. Gary could confirm that it is a first, a lecture on the Kamasutra, a first in the history of the American Academy. And so history is being done tonight, and you want to be very conscious of that. Before I say anything else about our visitor, I need to tell you that being deprived of our colleagueship with Wendy was among the high costs of Regina's and my move to Stanford from the University of Chicago in 1992. After 1992, Wendy and we still met, as she once wrote me, on the page, though not, alas, in person. I'm extraordinarily pleased that she accepted this invitation to give this lecture on nature and culture in the Kamasutra, and that therefore we meet again in person. Wendy is to coin a phrase, Wendy herself is a force of nature and culture. Wendy Doniger is the Mircea Eliade Distinguished Service Professor of History of Religions in the Divinity School of the University of Chicago. The sentence I just spoke gives us more than a title. It suggests part of Wendy's biography, as her professorship is not named for a donor, but for the historian of religion who spent almost 30 years at the University of Chicago between 1957 and his death in 1986. Wendy writes, I do my work under the name of Mircea Eliade, much as Winnie the Pooh lives under the name of Sanders. The word Sanders was on a sign above Pooh's doors, and Mircea Eliade is the title of my chair. And in fact, I do work under his bright shadow in many ways, as do most of the people in the field of the history of religions, whether or not they acknowledge their debt. I'm personally indebted to him for creating my career, transforming me from an ugly duckling of Sanskritist into a swan-like historian of religions. He read my Harvard Sanskrit PhD dissertation in 1968, published 2 chapters of it in his Chicago journal, History of Religions, in 1969, brought me to Chicago as a full professor in 1978, and the rest is, if not history, at least history of religions. When I began to think about how I should introduce Wendy, I discovered to my delight, as I have just shown, that at least recently she has been frequently autobiographical. For instance, I may refer to the introduction to her newest book on Hinduism, published by Oxford in 2014. After mentioning the role of her mother, whom she characterizes as an amateur Orientalist, and tonight at dinner she told me she also was a Stalinist, the amateur Orientalist, Wendy tells us, barely into my teens, I discovered that I loved the glorious excess of things Indian. I preferred Indian painting. I preferred Indian temples. I delighted in the reds and purples and oranges and yellows of Rajasthan silks and cottons. I liked Indian music, but most of all, I loved Hindu mythology, the stories of the gods. I particularly loved the way that the stories were told and retold over and over, each time differently. As a 17-year-old, Wendy decided to study Sanskrit at Radcliffe, Harvard. She stayed at Harvard through her PhD in 1968, but spent the year 1963-64 in India. Wendy on the web has one of the more extensive CVs that I've ever noticed. Yours goes on and on and on. And in relation to the scholarship in 1963 to 64, Wendy mentions still proudly, I think, that it was $6,000. And I could relate to that figure because my beginning salary as an assistant professor at the University of California in Berkeley 1 year later was $7,000. So you got a lot of money for a mere fellowship. Very impressive. Yes, I had to work, right. Her dissertation was on the subject of asceticism and eroticism in the mythology of Shiva, published as a book by Oxford in 1973. In 1973, Wendy also acquired a D.Phil in Oriental Studies from Oxford. For show and tell, I brought a copy of her first book. It called Asceticism and Eroticism in the Mythology of Shiva. And it had a remarkable trajectory for a book that began as a doctoral dissertation. After Oxford 1973, it was published in India in 1975. In 1981, as a paperback in the United States, and in 1993 in a French translation, and in 1997 in an Italian one. The Italian translation saw the light of day 24 years after the appearance of the original. Something like this happens only to Wendy and, as I learned last week, to Moïse Postone, a colleague, of course, of hers at the University of Chicago. 40 erudite book titles later, and after appointments at the University of London, at Berkeley, and then since 1978 at the University of Chicago, Wendy mentions the anthropologists, Indologists, historians of religion, classicists who became her closest colleagues, and then comments, "The nourishment I drew from friends in such a wide range of academic disciplines is reflected in the rather eclectic nature of what I wrote." Being a lawyer by background, I must not pass by Wendy's status as a celebrity in legal history. As she wrote last year, after a long career of relative obscurity in the ivory tower, I suddenly became notorious. Wendy's notoriety was brought about by the publication in 2009, 2010 in India, of her 780-page book, The Hindus, An Alternative History. For show and tell, I brought that too, so that you can all honestly see when asked, yes, I have seen that book. Here it is, here it is. It has really, I mean, it's a footnotes and so on, but 780 pages is a lot, Wendy.
Sorry about that.
You are excused. The book offers an alternative by giving us more than the Brahmin account of the most famous Sanskrit texts. I quote the author, "It tells a story that incorporates the narrative of and about alternative people. People who, from the standpoint of most high caste Hindu males, are alternative in the sense of otherness. People of other religions, or cultures, or castes, or species, animals, or gender, women." And indeed, Wendy listens to the women's voices in the Sanskrit classics, and I'm sure this will come up tonight in her talk about the Kamasutra. Her publisher for the Hindus was Penguin, and in India, the Indian subsidiary, Penguin India. A Hindu fundamentalist group brought suit against the book and against her under Section 295A of the Indian Penal Code, a provision enacted in 1927 by the British Raj when Muslims demanded criminal sanctions in response to a book about Muhammad's marriages and sex life. Section 295A of the Indian Penal Code, I'm a legal historian, reads, "Whoever, with deliberate and malicious intention of outraging the religious feelings of any class of citizens of India, by word either spoken or written, or by signs, or by visible representations, or otherwise, insults or attempts to insult the religion or the religious beliefs of that class shall be punished with imprisonment of either description for a term which may extend to 3 years, or with fine, or with both. Pingu in India defended the suit for 4 years, until Bertelsmann acquired a majority interest in Penguin from Pearson. Pingu in India then agreed to cease publishing the book and promised to pulp existing copies. The latter actually did not occur because all existing copies were sold in no time by Indian bookstores in brown paper bags. One commentator wrote, the real reason the book was banned in India was that it was not boring enough. I quote, the problem is that Wendy Doniger is a maverick and brilliant. Her wit bubbles up and escapes her almost in spite of herself. I'm happy to report that The Hindus is back on sale in India. Ravi Singh, who headed Penguin Books India when the alternative history was published, has launched a new company, Speaking Tiger. Now Singh has the Indian rights to the book and brought out a new paperback edition. At home in California, I am the proud owner of the original Penguin India edition. I obtained a copy of the book from an Indian friend soon after its publication. The price was 999 rupees. And on the quite voluptuous dust cover, it says, under the circumstances, incredibly ironically, for sale in the Indian subcontinent only. I give you one of the great scholars of the Sanskrit narratives, a maverick, brilliant, speaking tigress.
Thank you, Jeff. I can't possibly live up to that. You're all going to be disappointed. It was a terrible introduction. I can't be like that. It's a great introduction. I'm very glad to be back in Berlin and to see so many old friends in the audience. And thank you all for coming out and listening to my talk. And I look forward to having questions. And this is part of a book in progress. Everything's always part of a book in progress. So I look forward to the question and answer period afterwards and then talk to you some more. The past half-century has not been good for India's attitude toward its own erotic traditions. There's a lot of history here, and not merely colonial history, to explain why the Hindu nationalists are so terrified of sex. The rising tide of censorship in India expresses a cultural self-loathing that would like to erase the erotic power of Hindu texts. But there is hope. When Prime Minister Modi proposed an International Yoga Day recently, the comedian Vikramjit Singh proposed in the Times of India that it be replaced by Kamasutra Day. I think it's worth taking a closer look at this text and its legacy in contemporary India. Just a few Sanskrit words, just a few, I promise you. 5. Ancient Hindu texts speak of dharma, artha, and kama. That's the worst of it, as the 3 aims of human life, or the triple set, which every person was supposed to achieve in his lifetime, and it was meant for him. Dharma is the good life: duty, religion, merit, morality, social obligation, justice, righteousness, and the law. Artha is the high life: money, power, profit, success. Kama is the fine life: love, desire, and pleasure, not merely sexual, but more broadly sensual: music, good food, perfume. The Kamasutra, or the treatise, sutra is actually related to suture, stringing things together. The Kamasutra, or Treatise on Pleasure, is the oldest extant Indian textbook of erotic love and one of the oldest in the world. It's an astonishingly sophisticated text and was already well known in India at a time when the Europeans were still swinging in trees, culturally and sexually speaking. It was composed in Sanskrit, probably sometime in the second half of the 3rd century of the Common Era in North India. Virtually nothing is known about the author, named Vatsyayana, other than his name and what little we learn from the text, which he tells us is a distillation of the works of previous scholars, some of whom he quotes often in disagreement. None of their texts have come down to us. Vatsyayana, the author, cites them often, though his own voice always comes through as ringmaster over the many acts he incorporates in his sexual circus. Most people think the Kamasutra is a book about the positions in sexual intercourse, the erotic counterpart to the ascetic asanas of yoga. But the real Kamasutra is a book about the art of living, about finding a partner, maintaining power in a marriage, committing adultery, living as or with a courtesan, using drugs, and also about the positions in sexual intercourse. The many textbooks of eroticism that follow it eliminate most of the Kama Sutra's encyclopedic social and psychological narratives and concentrate primarily on the sexual positions, of which they describe many more than are in the Kama Sutra. The great textbook of politics called the Artha Shastra, that's the textbook, the Shastra of politics, Artha, I think that's really all the Sanskrit you need to know, is a compendium of advice for a king, combining much technical information on the running of a kingdom with a good deal of thought about human psychology. It was largely compiled in the middle of the 1st century CE and is therefore about a century older than the Kama Sutra. It gives no evidence of knowledge of any Kama Sutra, nor does it mention Kama as an organizing system. The Kama Sutra mentions an Artha Shastra only once and does not quote it. Yet the two texts are in conversation. This is part of my argument tonight. They exist together in one world, and an educated person in that world may well have read both of them. In the Artha Shastra, sex is the background for political power, but in the Kama Sutra, political power is merely the background for sex. The Kama Sutra borrowed heavily from the Artha Shastra, and this connection strongly influenced the worldview of the Kama Sutra. So my argument is how political the Kama Sutra is, and therefore how political the whole erotic tradition of India is. While the Artha Shastra is deeply suspicious of Kama in any shape or form, the Kama Sutra has respect for Artha, especially as far as courtesans are concerned. Remember, Artha means money as well as political power. Other scholars have noticed the influence of the form of the Artha Shastra on the Kama Sutra, but haven't realized how extensively and closely the content and philosophy of the Kama Sutra are inspired by those of the Artha Shastra. You'll recall how Sigmund Freud used the political idea of censorship as the basis of his idea of the censoring superego, which repressed sex as much as anything else. For Freud, as for the Kama Sutra, politics set the pattern for sex. I'll explore tonight first the evidence for this influence, and then the way that the Kama Sutra applies to sex the principles of politics, more precisely the shamelessly unethical politics of the Artha Shastra. I'll conclude with a brief speculation about the implications of this connection for the later history of the erotic literature of India, including the present moment of crisis. So to begin with, the Kama Sutra models both its format and its rhetoric closely on that of the Artha Shastra. Prose chapters containing down-to-earth, often non-dharmic or even anti-dharmic instructions going against the rules of the Hindu law books are capped by verses that express often contradictory, generally pro-dharmic exhortations. So you have long prose telling you to do something the Dharma Shastras would never dream of doing, and then a poem saying, of course, be a good boy. This hypocritical attitude to Dharma, as well as the use of verses to express the pro-dharmic overlay, is an important trait that the two texts have in common. In both texts, a point of view is stated and defended, an opposing view stated, sometimes a series of views, and then the author caps it with what he regards as the best argument. The two texts put this tradition to work in the tap dance they do around Dharma. That is, by quoting people that they ostensibly disagree with, that's the first guy's statement, they smuggle in a number of anti-dharmic arguments that they may well believe themselves, but don't want to own as their own, to get them on the table and then say, oh, don't do that, in much the manner that a lawyer might reveal evidence to a jury, and then, when reprimanded by the judge, say, the jury will disregard those remarks. For example, the Arthashastra cites and dismisses the opinions of a series of earlier authorities on the way to deal with the king's potentially patricidal sons, starting from the suggestion that the king killed them at birth. That's one way. And concluding with the suggestion that he have them corrupted by or addicted to pleasures. And then, having put on the table in the mouths of other people a number of truly diabolical suggestions that may never have occurred to anyone but the author of the Arthashastra, he caps the argument with his own less violent, though still rather heartless advice, quote, if he's an only son who is dear to him, the king should imprison him. If he has many sons, the king should banish him to the frontier or another region, end quote. Similarly, Vatsyayana, the author of the Kamasutra, cites several scholars in a discussion of the more unusual sexual positions before he launches into a general tirade of verses against sexual excess. The word scholars, acharyas, almost always has a pejorative tone in the Kamasutra, perhaps best translated as pedants. It's a term of honor in other texts, acharya. On one occasion, the text states, Vatsyayana says, since learned men disagree, and there are discrepancies in what the Dharma texts say, one should act according to the custom of the region and one's own disposition and confidence, end quote. Note the Kamasutra's casual scorn for the texts of Dharma and his awareness of their self-contradictions as well as his preference for individual conscience. The two texts share other anti-Dharma attitudes. Both of them make use of people that most ancient Indian texts regarded as marginalized. They use them as spies for the political text or go-betweens for the Kamasutra, strolling actors and musicians, gamblers, drunks, which the Dharma texts warn you against, as well as religious mendicants and ascetics, both male and female, which the Dharma texts admire. They're an essential part of the Kamasutra's crew of panders, libertines, and hangers-on. And they're also the Arthashastra's basic CIA material. So the Dharma texts tell you how to be an ascetic. The Arthashastra tells a spy to pretend to be an ascetic. And the Kamasutra tells you to employ an ascetic as a go-between, like Romeo and Juliet. It's a three-way conversation, as the texts are manipulating the same cultural conventions in different ways. Within this shared framework, there are a number of incidental passages in which the Arthashastra has clearly provided the paradigm for the Kamasutra. We'll skip this. I want time for questions. Both the Arthashastra and the Kamasutra offer magic spells to make you invisible, using an ointment that you put on your eyes, projecting sightlessness onto the person who looks at you. Like children, right? I'm invisible. Both texts are concerned that when you make yourself invisible, you must also take care to make your shadow invisible too. The paranoid psychology of the political text casts its shadow over the erotic text. The Arthashastra is often said to be Machiavellian. The standard Sanskrit dictionary of Sir Monier Williams refers to the author of the Kamasutra, a man named Kautilya, as the Machiavelli of India. Kautilya, the author of the Arthashastra, whose name actually means crookedness, Kautilya makes Machiavelli look like Mother Teresa. Suspicion, treachery, and trickery pervade the Arthashastra, and much of this carries over into the Kamasutra. For instance, I'll give you some wonderful examples. The Kamasutra's list of people in the enemy's territory who are dissatisfied and therefore can be seduced politically is the model for the Kamasutra list of women in their husband's territory, as it were, who are dissatisfied or unsatisfied, and so can be seduced sexually. So I'll compare the two lists. First, the Arthashastra. Quote. It's a long list. The set of angry people is as follows. Someone who is cheated out of things he has been promised, between two people who carry out a craft equally well, the one who is slighted, someone disgraced on account of a king's favorite, someone who's incensed at being exiled, someone who didn't get the job after incurring expenses, someone who's prevented from carrying out the dharma specific to him or from receiving his inheritance, someone stripped of honors or office, someone held back by members of the royal family, someone whose wife has been forcibly molested, someone put in prison, someone who's been fined after losing a lawsuit, someone who has been restrained from engaging in wrongful conduct. I love that one, right? Someone whose entire property has been confiscated, someone who has been harassed in prison, and someone whose relative has been executed. So those are the vulnerable people. The Kama Sutra apes this technique in a very long list of which I'll give just a few examples. The following are women who can be had without any effort at all. A woman who's been supplanted by a co-wife for no reason. A woman who hates her husband. A woman who is hated. A woman who has no children. A woman who's always lived in the house of her relatives. A woman who is fond of society. The wife of an actor. That's a great one. A young woman whose husband has died. A poor woman fond of enjoying herself. The wife of the oldest of several brothers. A very proud woman who has an inadequate husband. A woman who's proud of her skills and distressed by her husband's foolishness. This is what I made about sympathy for women in this text. Distressed by her husband's foolishness, lack of distinction, or greediness. A woman whose intelligence, nature, wisdom, perception, and personality are similar to those of the would-be lover. A woman who has been dishonored by her husband when she has done nothing wrong. A woman whose husband travels a lot. The wife of a man who is jealous, putrid, too pure, impotent, a procrastinator, unmanly, a hunchback, a dwarf, deformed, a jeweler, a villager, bad-smelling, sick, or old. In a similar parallelism, the internal debate of potential adulterers in the Kama Sutra persuading themselves of the moral justice of their actions mirrors the similarly imagined meditations of spies in the Arthashastra and the king's self-persuasions and justifications for seizing power. In a pair of, I'll read this too. Another text that the Kama Sutra clearly picks up from the Arthashastra is the constant use of male and female messengers, dutas they're called, which replicates the far more meaningful constant employment of male and female spies, dutas, in the Arthashastra. Both texts recommend the use of monks, nuns, and religious mendicants as spies, Arthashastra, or go-betweens, Kama Sutra, in neither case demonstrating the least bit of respect for the possible actual religiosity or reputation of such people. All of this spying casts a presumption of dishonesty and betrayal over erotic relationships, a mood that remains a part of Hindu erotic discourse. In a pair of closely parallel texts, the Arthashastra presents a fourfold typology of repentant traitors. Those who have left and returned are of four types. One who left and returned for a proper reason, and the opposite. One who left for a proper reason but returned without a proper reason, and the opposite of that. It is but the work of a moment for the Kama Sutra to convert this into a sixfold typology of lovers who leave the courtesan and then may or may not be taken back. Quote, if he's going elsewhere, she must find out about him. He may belong in any of the six possible categories. He left her of his own accord, and he left the other woman too of his own accord. He left both her and the other woman because they got rid of him. He left her of his own accord, and he left the other woman because she got rid of him. He left her of his own accord and stayed with the other woman. He left her because she got rid of him, and he left the other woman of his own accord. He left her because she got rid of him, and he stayed with the other woman. Those are the permutations. We are talking in the same world. I'll skip this testing. Yeah, okay. One would have thought that a concern for the control of the senses would be more important to the Arthashastra than to the Kamasutra, but not so. This problem pervades both texts. The Arthashastra sees as more dangerous than any other threat the enemy within, more precisely the 6 enemies within: desire, anger, greed, plus pride, conceit, and excitement. And it lists a series of kings who were destroyed by this dangerous sextet. The Kamasutra uses an abbreviated version of the same list, beginning with a word-for-word quotation of the tale of the first unfortunate sinner on the Arthashastra's list. But in this passage about kings destroyed by Kama, the author of the Kamasutra is not speaking for himself. He says he's quoting people who worry about Artha. People of other schools whom the author of the Kamasutra imagines as objecting to his book about Kama because they worry too much about Artha. Kautilya's arguments about the dangers of Kama seem to be precisely what Vatsyayana quotes the people who worry about Artha as saying about the dangers of Kama. In other words, he's quoting the Arthashastra saying, watch out for Kama, using the same people and the same words. So this is what Kautilya says. Kama involves disgrace, the depletion of resources, and association with undesirable people, robbers, gamblers, hunters, singers, and musicians. They come up again. And this is what the Kamasutra says the people who worry about Artha say. He says they say, Kama makes a man associate with worthless people and undertake bad projects, makes him a man with no future as well as careless, lightweight, untrustworthy, and unacceptable. Vatsyayana answers this by saying food has its problems too, but you can't do without it. But is Vatsyayana just imagining people who slander Kama in this way? Is it not possible that here he's actually quoting the Arthashastra and obliquely criticizing Kautilya for worrying too much about Artha? The area in which the text most explicitly converges is in the treatment of sexuality. The two texts agree on some points and disagree on others. Let's begin with the agreements. The Kamasutra's lists of reasons that justify adultery include many that are far more political than erotic. This is what some of the would-be adulterers say to themselves. He quotes one guy, justifying committing adultery. This woman has her husband entirely under her control, and he's a great and powerful man who's intimate with my enemy. If she becomes intimate with me, out of her affection for me, she will make him reverse his allegiance. Or, that powerful man is turned against me and wishes to harm me. She'll bring him back to his former nature. Or, if I make him my friend through her, by sleeping with her, I will be able to do favors for my friends, or ward off my enemies, or accomplish some other difficult undertaking. Or, if I become intimate with this woman and kill her husband, I will get for myself the power of his great wealth, which ought to be mine. Or, there's no danger involved in my having this woman, and there's a chance of wealth. And since I'm useless, I've exhausted all means of making a living. Such as I am, I'll get a lot of money from her in this way with very little trouble. Or, this is just part of it. This woman is madly in love with me and knows all my weaknesses. If I reject her, she will ruin me by publicly exposing my faults. Or she will accuse me of some fault which I do not in fact have, but which will be easy to believe of me and hard to clear myself of, and this will be the ruin of me. Or, it goes on and on like that, or this woman's husband is the seducer of the women in my harem. I will pay him back for that by seducing his wives too. Or, by the king's command, I will kill his enemy, who is hiding inside. Or, my enemy is united with this woman's husband. Through her, I will get him to drink a poison. He concludes, for these and similar reasons, one may seduce even the wife of another man, but nothing rash should be done merely because of passion. That's the Kamasutra. Thus, the Kama Sutra accepts as sufficient reason for adultery using a woman to protect a king or kill an enemy, but passion is not an acceptable reason. The basic distrust of passion is a quality that the Kama Sutra shares with the Arthashastra, and the other rather far-fetched political motives are surely the direct legacy of the Arthashastra. The Arthashastra regards as sexually available a woman whom a man has saved when she has been carried away by a flood or left in the wilderness during a time of famine, or whom he has rescued from robbers, or when she had been lost, abandoned, or left for dead. Similarly, the Kama Sutra suggests that a man might pick up a married woman during the spectacle of a house on fire, the commotion after a robbery, or the invasion of the countryside by an enemy. The Arthashastra base of the Kama Sutra's portrayal of the relationship between the sexes is expressed by the astounding statement in the Kama Sutra. They say that sex is a form of quarreling because the very essence of desire is a contest and its character is competitive, end quote. The commentary on the Kama Sutra is 1,000 years later, but it's the only commentary we have. The commentator explains the competition, quote, because the man and the woman each try to achieve their own desires by overcoming the other, end quote. This agonistic view of sex is the essence of the Kama Sutra. But who is the they in they say? They say that sex is a form of quarreling. Kautilya and his colleagues? And does the author of the Kama Sutra go along with this opinion? I think he does. Much of the Kama Sutra is devoted to trickery and deception of one sort or another. The man tricks the parents of a young girl into letting him have her, or tricks the girl into eloping with him. The married woman tells lies as she jockeys for power against her co-wives. The adulterer deceives the woman's husband. The courtesan lies in order to get her customers to give her more money. Various people use drugs to cloud the minds of their sexual objects. The resulting agonistic and duplicitous view of sex set the stage for much of the mythological substructure of later Indian erotic drama, poetry, and narrative. The Kama Sutra also establishes a code of acceptable sexual violence. The inflicting of physical pain by scratching, biting, and slapping is an important part of the sexual act. There's a poem about it. There are no keener means of increasing passion than acts inflicted with tooth and nail. More disturbing are the passages in the Kama Sutra where women's exclamations are taken not as inclinations of their wish to escape pain being inflicted on them, but merely as part of a ploy designed to excite their male partners. Quote, always, if a man tries to force his kisses and so forth on her, she moans and does the very same thing back to him. When a man in the throes of passion slaps a woman repeatedly, she uses words like stop, or let me go, or enough, or mother, and utters screams mixed with labored breathing, panting, crying, and groaning. Those are the ways of groaning and slapping, end quote. These passages inculcate what we now recognize as the rape mentality. Her mouth says no, but her eyes say yes, disregarding a woman's protests against physical abuse. Indeed, both the Arthashastra and the Kama Sutra list rape as one of the worst but still acceptable forms of wedding devices. It should be noted here that the Kama Sutra is in general remarkably favorable to women, but in this one instance, it goes along with the more misogynist side of the culture. For two sharply contrasting attitudes to women can be traced in Indian texts from the ancient period to the modern. The Dharma texts, insisting on the control and denigration of women, dominated conventional and legal attitudes to women, particularly among the middle classes, while the Kama Sutra tradition, with its far more liberal and complex admiration of women, never ceased to be appreciated by royal and upper-class merchant society. But as it combined with other factors in the Hindu social system that led to a more general devaluing of women, the Arthashastric Kama Sutra, that is, the Kama Sutra under the shadow of the political text, also contributed greatly to the culture of violence against women. The Indian version of the widespread idea that sex and women are dangerous does not, of course, originate in our two texts. It's well documented in ancient India centuries before the period in question, and it dominates the misogynist traditions of Hindu Dharma ever after. Both the Kamasutra and the Arthashastra may be responding to a society in which the political culture of spying and violence is already closely linked with sex. Or the Kamasutra may have adopted these elements from the Arthashastra. But in any case, from then on, sex and violence are joined at the hip. And the particular concept of a sexual relationship as a war with no Geneva Conventions, a conflict in which the two parties try to deceive and outmaneuver one another, an encounter that requires ambassadors and truces, a battle in which the combatants conceal or display the wounds they receive from slaps and bites and scratches. These major themes of Indian erotic fiction owe as much to the Arthashastra as to the Kamasutra. The Arthashastric Kamasutra was a major influence upon the erotic literary traditions of India, particularly but not only court poetry, which reveled in the suffering of the abandoned heroine, the tragedies caused by careless or lustful messengers, the deceptions and betrayals. The Kamasutra played a less obvious but more important role in the eroticism of the Hindu devotional tradition, in which the worshipper often imagined himself as a woman in the erotic thrall of the male god, Krishna or Shiva. This branch of Hinduism emphasized divine abandonment, deception, betrayal, and even physical violence. The surface metaphor of human desire, with its cliché of nail marks betraying infidelity, leads to the dark implications of divine desire, the God who is not merely caught with lipstick on his collar, but who is not there for you as a God, the otios God, or deus absconditus, the theological parallel to the romantic theme of painful longing for the absent lover, the God who desires your pain, walking on fire, swinging from hooks, and who deceives you with his power of illusion. The Apache syndrome of Indian eroticism, he is so cruel to me and I love him so, may be seen in Nietzsche in the Kamasutra, which strongly influenced the way in which Indian culture developed its unique understanding of the politics of sex. But the Kamasutra is also highly Arthashastric in its disregard of Dharma, and we must be grateful to it not only for its openness, its psychological profundity, but for its brave challenge to some of the more repressive aspects of the Dharma text's attitude to sexuality. Where the Arthashastra almost always toes the Dharma line on sexuality, though certainly not on politics, the Kamasutra often diverges wildly from it. In general, the Kamasutra assumes a kind of sexual freedom for women that would have appalled the Dharma scholars, but simply does not interest Kautilya. Vajrayana tells us that a woman who does not experience the pleasures of love may hate her man and leave him for another. If, as the context suggests, this woman is married, the casual manner in which Vajrayana suggests that she leave her husband is in sharp contrast to the politics assumed by the Dharma text. This is what they say. This is Manu. A virtuous wife should constantly serve her husband like a god, even if he behaves badly, freely indulges his lust, and is devoid of any good qualities, end quote. So the Kamasutra is an improvement on that. Vajrayana casually mentions among the women that one might sleep with, not only second-hand women who've been with another guy, but widows, whom the Dharma texts positively forbid to remarry. The Kamasutra says, quote, "A widow who is tormented by the weakness of the senses finds again a man who enjoys life and is well endowed with good qualities," end quote. And among the circumstances in which a man might pick up a married woman, including, a burning house and the invasion of an army, the Kamasutra lists on the occasion of visiting the gods, or at a sacrifice, a wedding, or a religious festival. Somehow, I don't think the Dharma text would approve of the man in question meeting married women at all, let alone using devotion to the gods as an occasion for it. Indeed, by devoting an entire book of the 7 books of the Kamasutra, one entire book is devoted to adultery, The Kamasutra has simply disdained Dharma. And given the enormous emphasis that the Dharma texts place on having sex only to produce children, and their insistence that a man must have sex with his wife in her every fertile season and never at any other time, and the Arthashastra echoes this, the Kama Sutra's assumption that people differ from animals precisely in their ability to have sex separate from fertility is wildly anti-dharmic. What happens to gender issues when the politics of the Arthashastra are applied to sex? In Dharma texts and the Arthashastra, male homoerotic activity was punished, although mildly, a ritual bath or the payment of a small fine. The Kama Sutra departs from the Dharmic view of homosexuality in significant ways, principally by not regarding it as a crime at all. It describes in totally non-judgmental language two types of men who make their living performing oral sex on other men. One is a cross-dressing man with stereotypical female gender behavior, shyness, flirtation, and all that. The other, a closeted man who dresses in man's clothing. This second type is described within a remarkably explicit analysis of the mentality of the closet, the extended double entendre of an act that is cleverly designed to appear sexually innocent to a man who does not want or does not want to admit that he wants a homosexual encounter, but is an explicit invitation to a man who is willing to admit his desire for such an encounter. The Kama Sutra also describes men who seem bound to one another by discriminating affection rather than promiscuous passion. Nowhere else in the entire corpus of ancient Sanskrit literature is there such a positive portrayal of men who have sex with men. To conclude with the present, these are no longer theoretical, purely academic issues. Nowadays, real live people in India are getting beaten up, sometimes killed, for their perceived erotic transgressions. The criminal lawsuit that Gerhard Kasper referred to, what was brought against me, and Penguin Books scolded me by saying, your approach, quote, your approach is that of a woman hungry of sex, end quote. Some of my graduate students picked up on this and used it to say to me things like, when is the woman hungry of sex having office hours this week? Well, she is still writing books. My brave or perhaps foolhardy Indian publisher, Ravi Singh, who's known to some of his friends as Ravishing, you just bring the H up, and it's, who originally published The Hindus and has now published this new edition, has also published a book by me about the Kama Sutra. Clearly, Ravishing is the hero of this story, but why should publishers have to be heroes? In his play about the life of Galileo, a man who stood up for what he believed against powerful enemies for a while, Bertolt Brecht said, pity the land that needs heroes. Unglücklich das Land, das Helden nötig hat. I feel that India has become such a land, and I was lucky to find a hero in Ravishing, who also conceived of and published the new book about the Kama Sutra, my new book about the Kama Sutra. A review of the book began by asking, can the Kama Sutra wage a war of freedom to rescue the Indian middle class? And ended by asking, can the Kama Sutra be an ally in a war to liberate the contemporary Indian middle class that is as repressed as the Victorians, end quote. It's a lot to ask of a text, but the Kama Sutra is a survivor, a very brave and politically canny text. It has been read and enjoyed for over 2 millennia, and it will, I think, long outlive the present government of India. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Wendy will handle her own questions on this. I'll assist her. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Wendy. A question about passion. You mentioned that both in the Arthashastra and the Kamasutra, passion is the enemy.
Yep.
It clouds the mind, it interferes with calculation. It's rather like what Watson said about Holmes with regard to Irene Adler. Mm-hmm. Not that he felt anything like love for Irene Adler, which would have been a grain of sand in a well-oiled machine. Mm-hmm. The question is about passion in religion. Mm-hmm. The one area in your talk where passion seems to be allowed free rein is in the cultivation of religion, a strange anomaly that is in the realm of dharma, that most bestial element of human nature should be given its head. The question is, have I understood correctly? Is that right?
Yes and no. Yes and no. What a good question. I spoke of the Dharma text and the tradition of the Dharma text, and they are uniformly against passion. The Dharma texts just feel that that's one of the reasons for being a vegetarian. It has nothing to do with protecting fuzzy animals. It's because putting meat in you is bad for you. It makes you passionate. So everything in the Dharma text is designed to keep you very cool and to avoid situations in which you might become passionate in any way. Anger and fear, but lust especially. The Dharma texts represent one line of India which involves the control of the passions, meditation, asceticism, hatred of women, better not to marry, better not to have kids. If you're lucky, you're an ascetic and live all by yourself and just think about God all day. That's one form of Hinduism which is alive and well and is fueling a great deal of the BJP rhetoric to this day, the Bhagavad Gita, meditation, and all of that. There's another branch of Hinduism which originates in the Rig Veda, really, the earliest text, and goes on and is alive and well in the epics, in the Puranas, and all the texts that I write about. One of the reasons I get into trouble is because I write about the other kind of Hinduism, which has been there from the beginning, which is about passion, which is about women with breasts like mangoes, and it's about eating good food as much as possible of it, and it's about worshiping the gods by dancing and singing and getting high on marijuana and all sorts of things, and they're both part of the same religion. And in the past, they've lived sort of side by side. People who do one think the other people are wrong, and the people who do the other one think the other people are missing a lot of fun, but they have tolerated one another, and that's one reason why Hinduism is such a complicated religion. What's new in India today, the law that Gerhard Casper read, is the idea that you can say what you're doing offends me, and therefore you better stop or to go to jail. So it's involved not merely the censorship of works of art and literature, but the censorship of behavior as well. You can't do that, and so forth. So the passionate part of Indian religion, the swinging on hooks, the walking on fire, doing all sorts of physical mutilations, and also doing drugs and tantric sexual rituals and so forth, that's quite central. That's not peripheral. I call that the center. I think the ascetics are the periphery, in my humble opinion. But in any case, they're both there in India, and the Dharma texts are part of the first kind of the control freaks are in the Dharma texts, and in the yogis and so forth. And this other form of Hinduism is the Hinduism of kings, but it's also the Hinduism of merchants. I'm partly a class thing, but it's also the Hinduism of poor people who, that's how they celebrate. They have something good to eat, or they get drunk, or whatever it is. And the rituals to the gods are often blood sacrifices, violence. They're also physical violence. They used to be more physical mutilation than there is now. But I mean, all the extreme things, they're right there. You go to Durga Puja in Calcutta and you'll see it to this day, that kind of behavior. And at the same time, if you go to parts of Benares, you'll see people who do nothing but chant all day long. So yes and no. And thank you for the question.
Thank you, Professor Doniger. That was fascinating. If I might just for a second, from a standpoint which is sadly not a history of religion standpoint, so I'm the interloper here, but from a cultural historical standpoint, might sort of try to be the apologist for the dharmic tradition's capacity to sort of, shall we say, kidnap at times, assimilate at times the wilder, the more passionate strand of Hinduism. So if I understood your talk correctly, you're sort of making this distinction between the dharmic and the karma-oriented, the passion-oriented strands, which I totally agree with. And I feel, and I agree with your prognosis that the mutual tolerance, or at least the mutual sufferance of these two traditions is what has led to today's situation. But
the failure of the mutual tolerance has led to today's situation. The tolerance was there all those other years.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
It's broken down now.
Yeah. Would you sort of then say that the fact that there was this mutual toleration before shows that both these traditions kind of cocked a snook at each other and sort of had the capacity to sort of function side by side, and that was not necessarily a binary?
Certainly. They nurtured each other in all sorts of ways. And it's not like the population was divided. People had dharmic aspects of their lives and more erotic aspects of their lives. Just in terms of the calendar, there are certain times, sort of what my old colleague Victor Turner would call the liminal moments of various ways, in which everybody broke away from the Dharma. People who were just behaved themselves all the time at Holi and at certain periods. So there certainly are moments, times of life and so forth. Also, Hinduism divides into different periods. At some point, you're supposed to be more religious than at other times. No, that's how they got along all those years, was by those millennia, we're talking about a long time, by a kind of a mutual appreciation of one another. And that's what is so tragically lost in the kind of censorship that's going on now and how unprecedented it is, really. Hindus, there's a distinction which is too neat, but it's useful, and we all use it like Google or Amazon or Wikipedia. We know we shouldn't, but we do. So this is sort of a Wikipedia statement, which is that some religions are more orthodox and others are more orthoprax. That some religions care very much about what you say and think, and you get burnt at the stake for not saying the right thing. And other religions don't care as much. They all care a little bit. Don't care much. Will not punish you much for what you say or think, but they will punish you for what you do. So Hinduism has been intolerant in an orthoprax way, always really, because of the caste system. So if someone of the wrong caste goes into the wrong temple, he gets beaten to death. You just don't do certain things. Women in certain castes don't cover their breasts. If they do cover their breasts, then they're beaten up and so forth. So there are a lot of rules about behavior, but it's in the realm of free expression that Hinduism has been more tolerant in comparison to the monotheisms in particular, who stick to the word, so that too, the history of intolerance in behavior is spilling over now into an intolerance. It's not that they were always great and it was only the Inquisition was the only bad guys in the world. It was that they were great in a particular way which they are losing, and it's being infected by the way in which they were not so great in the past.
Can I ask a historical question?
Please.
How was this book available to people at that time? Were there maybe several books of similar content? Or was there one book that people copied, maybe copied all the pictures of these books? I don't know.
Yep. It's a good question.
How was it spread? Was there printing available?
There wasn't printing available for a long time. What there was available was scribes, a culture of scribes. Rich people had scribes that they employed, kings had scribes they employed. Because of the climate of India, which is very hot and wet, and also because there's a lot of red ants that eat things, we have almost no manuscripts that are more than 200 or 300 years old. There's one exception in the Northwest. They found a kind of a Dead Sea Scrolls cache of Buddhist texts fairly recently that are very old. But other than that, any manuscript you have won't date past the 16th century. It was copied, however, from a manuscript from the 14th century, which was copied from, so they were constantly copied and copied and copied, and that's also how they were distributed. It was an act of merit. It was also an act of culture to show. People had libraries then, as we have now. Look what I have on the shelf and so forth. So they were constantly copied by scribes. There was a business. Scribes were always Brahmins, so eventually they were always copied, and they were distributed. They were sometimes illustrated. The great illustrations of the Kamasutra, the most famous ones, actually come from the Persian period, when the Mughals in North India had a great empire. We're talking about 15th, 16th, 17th century at their height, and brought the technique of Persian miniature painting into India, which hadn't really had that particular technique. So then they became Indo-Persian mixed, a new school of Indian miniature painting, a very beautiful school of Northern Indian miniature painting, and that's where the great famous illustrated Kamasutras come from. So this is the oldest one, although it says that it worked with other texts that are lost, and we just don't have any of them. And after the Kamasutra, there were several other textbooks, erotic textbooks, but they're really just about sex, whereas the Kama Sutra is about all these other things as well. A really ethnographic study of Northern Indian wealthy people and the ways that they had of having fun. And that's not in the later books. That's in the later books. So women are this kind of women, and this woman has legs like this, and they get very physical and very boring, really. The Kama Sutra is the great ethnography, really, and it was never repeated. There was never another one like it.
So, thank you. Thank you very much. This is a very ignorant question. Mm-hmm. I'm quite convinced by your parallels that you've drawn between the political text and the Kama Sutra. And I'm also struck by the fact this combines with the thesis that the Kama Sutra is a liberatory text. Mm-hmm. Now, on the face of it, if the influence of the political text is to see things in terms of using various individuals for, as it were, egocentric goals, it doesn't look as though it's going to lend itself to a lot of liberation. So I wonder whether that's just a silly worry.
No, it's a good question. No, it requires an interesting bit of clarification. So what came first, the earliest texts we have are the Dharma texts. They begin several centuries before the beginning of the Kama era. So that's the standard from which we deviate, and deviate we do indeed. So the Dharma texts put down the ways you have to behave, and they're socially, in this orthoprax way, they're very constricted. You have to treat the Brahmins very well and treat the untouchables very badly and all that kind of stuff. Much more to it. You mustn't eat anything, just about anything. You mustn't eat almost anything at all, really, if you're being careful. And you wash yourself all day long. So those are the Dharma texts. So the Kama Sutra and the Arthashastra, let's take the Arthashastra first, still pretend that they respect this. That's there's a sort of a Hayes office veneer. We really believe in Dharma, of course, and the king must behave himself. They say that. When then you look at what the king's supposed to do, he's supposed to murder his kids, which does not go with anybody's Dharma in the world anywhere, and is certainly a spectacular violation of Hindu attitudes toward the raising of children. So the Arthashastra begins by basically just kicking Dharma out. And the Kama Sutra does too. So in that sense, it is liberating from the constraints of caste dharma. Now, it's not liberating from egotism. It's not liberating from male chauvinism and sort of the stuff of the world, but at least it's liberating from the Brahmin stranglehold on social behavior. In that sense, it's liberating, and therefore the attitude toward women, that women can have can commit adultery, the idea that a woman could actually commit adultery and go on living, not being strangled and having her nose and breast cut off, which was the normal standard for a woman committing adultery, that these things could happen at all, that it's just an amazing disregard of the dharmic world. And in that sense, it's liberating. We're stuck with a culture that has its own limitations, and which includes violence toward women as one of the givens of the culture. So I'm ricocheting between praising the Kamasutra for the good things it says and pointing out that, by the way, we don't take it seriously when a woman says stop. One of the reasons that this is not well known is because most people have read the Kamasutra in the translation by Sir Richard Burton, which is a very bad translation, in which in particular he totally erases the women's voices. So the passage I read to you where she says, stop, let go, mother, he says he should disregard any statement about wishing for cessation or liberation. That's how he translates let go. It still has its aspects of the culture to deal with, some of which are negative aspects, but it is remarkable in its disregard of Dharma. In that sense, it's liberating.
But it seems to be lurching from one form of unfreedom to another form of unfreedom.
Yeah. Yes. The chapter on the courtesans is an extraordinary chapter about the independence of women. These are women who are not whores. They are women of culture. They know lots of languages. They live by their own selves in their houses. They have only one lover ever or at a time, and they can call all sorts of shots and so forth. So there's the image of a liberated woman is an extraordinary portrait in that chapter. And the sympathy for women, the chapter on wives is a wonderful chapter. It assumes a household with several wives, and it tells you how to maneuver. Like if you're the one that he's not sleeping with, you lose a lot of power, but there are things you can do to the one he is sleeping with in various ways, depending on how fond of her he really is, and so forth. And it's a marvelous book that takes quite seriously the personalities and individual needs and desires of women, which is not in the Dharma text at all. You're just there to make babies and shut up. That's it. So it's progress. It's a step in the right direction, but you're right. It has enormous constraints built into it, including the one that I care about very much, about violence. Yeah.
Do we know, do we have any way of knowing how well known these texts were, who read them, what portion of the population, just the place of the texts themselves in Indian society?
We know quite a bit. We know that the Kamasutra itself is one of the only sources I know for a really developed statement about how written texts are disseminated among illiterate people. And it comes in the very beginning of the second book, where it says this text should be read by men and it should be read by women too. It assumes that most women don't know Sanskrit, although it says the daughters of kings and ministers of state do know Sanskrit. But he says, that's not what I'm talking about. He says, only a few people know the text, but they tell other people about it. The text is the ultimate source of the idea, even when people can't read the text. He says, for instance, the priests are not astronomers, but they know how to do the sacrifice at the proper time when the constellations are right because the astronomers tell them. The guys in the stable don't read the textbook on how to treat horses, the Sanskrit text on how to treat horses, but they find out what's in those textbooks from people who have read it. So the text envisions itself as diffused through a population of people who are lower than the class or that has access to Sanskrit learning. So what we really know is that the Kama Sutra's ideas appear in all sorts of Sanskrit texts, and as soon as we have a vernacular, which begins in South Indian in the 4th or 5th century and then later in Hindi, it's quoted in Hindi texts and in Tamil texts, and ideas and stories that occur in the Kama Sutra are quoted in folk tales when we finally have access to them. So it filters down. It's really known in the courts. It's a royal, upper class ruling class ideology, basically. The Kamasutra itself says anyone who has a lot of money can live this life, no matter what the class is. The Kamasutra there's another anti-dharmic thing. It doesn't care what class you are. If you have the cash, you can live this life. So it's limited to rich people, so that limits it in that sense. But the ideas get into love poetry. So stories of benighted lovers, and her family won't let her marry him and she runs away and so forth. The motifs of the Kama Sutra get into those stories. There's a whole section on how to break into the harem. One way is to make yourself invisible. Another way is to get someone to wrap you up in a quilt and being taken in with the laundry. This whole how to get into the harem. And that's part of the narrative folklore of India. It gets into this Kama Sutra from it. It gets back out into, so it diffuses into narrative in some ways as well. The angry heroine who finds that her lover has been unfaithful because of the marks on his body of the woman's nails or teeth is a motif which is diffused all through Indian erotic literature and through religious literature in the many love songs that men sing to Krishna and Shiva, pretending that they are, it's in Foster's Passage to India. I say to him, come to me, come to me, come to me. He neglects to come, and so forth. So that longing for the lover who doesn't arrive is a basic motif of Indian erotic literature and religious literature, and it basically filters through the whole agonistic mythology of the Kama Sutra. So I think it had a great effect. I think it really did, particularly with the ruling classes, but it gets even into folklore as well. It sort of set the standard for how people talked about sexual love.
Saying something about the language of the Kama Sutra as compared with other classical Sanskrit texts.
It's very hard to translate. The sentences, it's why there's a lot of differences about it. The sentences often consist of a sutra as a string. Remember, it's like the word suture. And it particularly represents a kind of literature which consists of very gnomic, haiku-like sayings in a way, where there are not verbs but simply a series of nouns and you're not sure what the relationship is. So it takes a certain amount of work to translate it. Its vocabulary is also peculiar. There are a lot of hapax legomena in it because it deals with, there's a whole section on things you're supposed to eat before you make love and things you're supposed to eat after you make love, and it's hard to figure out what the plants are that go into the drugs, eye of newt and all of that, but after eye of newt, what is it next, and so forth. It's hard to figure out what things are. There's one of the, it tells you the woman how to plant a garden. It lists all the things you should plant in the garden, and one of the things you plant in the garden is alu. And Burton translated that as potato, because if you go to any Indian restaurant, alu is the word for potato. What is wrong with this picture? The Kama Sutra is 2nd century. We didn't have potatoes then. So then what was alu, right? It was some other kind of good thing to eat that when they found potato, they thought was even better than it, right? So there's a New York sentence. So it's hard to translate. It's not a book that you leaf through. It's not a dirty book. It's not a fun book. It's a scientific treatise written in the conventions of the scientific treatise, which is very concentrated. So you might memorize it in that sense. You just have a few words. So translating it was actually more difficult than almost anything I've ever translated. I usually do narrative texts. Mahabharata you can do in your sleep. It's just dum-de-dum-dum-dum. But Kama Sutra, you really have to decipher. And there are, I decided to translate the names of all the plants, but they're all guesses. I mean, the alternative is just to leave them in Sanskrit, then you have nothing at all. So you can make a sort of a guess. It's a tuber, it's like a radish, it's like a carrot or whatever it is. There are certain plants that the women in the harem are advised to plant, which include cucumbers, carrots, and other phallic-shaped objects. So you can figure out what plants those would be if you realize how they're being used by the women in the harem. So it's a hard text to translate, and Burton didn't translate it either. He paid some Indian to translate it, and he then cleaned up the English during a 2-month trip to India at one point. And it's a shame that that's the standard translation, because he misses so much that's really interesting in the Kamasutra, and particularly he just puts negatives in where the text says if a wife catches her husband keeping adultery, one of the things she can do is embarrass him in public in front of his friends. He puts in a not. If she finds him committing adultery, she must not embarrass him in front of his friends. You say, oh, wow, what did I miss? Where was that negative? Yeah. So the Burton translation is a misleading translation. Sudhir Kakar and I did a new translation some years ago, and there are 1 or 2 others since then also, which are better than the Burton translation. But it's a hard book to translate.
Of course, your translation, the recent one, has been translated into German.
Yes, it has.
So, like in the 19th century,
that's right.
You use an English text that is a translation.
That's right, because it was so different from the other available English ones. Yep.
It reads, by the way, so you have violated the text, because your book reads wonderfully. Well, very easy.
Well, that's what a translation is. You translate it into a language so it can be read in that language. So, yeah. I translated. It's a wonderful text. It was hard because English, perhaps not German. German is always better for Sanskrit because of the compounds. You can do that in German, and I just envy all my German colleagues who do that. English also has a problem because English veers between the medical and the pornographic when it talks about sex. And the Kamasutra is neither medical nor pornographic. So, intercourse is not really the word you want, but you just certainly don't want to say fuck either. And where are you? So I used words like I don't want to say have sex, which I think is a barbarism. So I used words like making love or something. I used more novelistic language for it, as I thought avoiding the two extremes of the obscene and the medical. So that makes it read more like a novel. A man should do this and do that, and so forth and so forth. Also, the Sanskrit tends to use the optative case where we would use the indicative. He should do this, he should do. You can't just keep saying should forever. I felt it read better if you put in the indicative. He does this and then he does that. A man who wants to please a woman does this and that and that. So I changed the tenses from the optative. So one has to do a lot to pull the text across the barrier from Sanskrit to English, more than with a narrative text where you can just sort of read it and write it in English. So.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you very, very much.